My family kicked me out of my father's house on the day of his funeral. That morning, I stood beside his casket, holding a black umbrella and trying not to collapse from exhaustion. By the afternoon, my stepmother had changed the locks, my brother had carried my suitcase onto the porch, and my sister looked at me as if I had finally gotten what I deserved. None of them even tried to hide their satisfaction. For them, everything had already been settled in the lawyer's office. According to the will, my father had left me $1. $1 after 3 years spent beside him. I cooked his meals, drove him to appointments, watched his medications, and listened at night to make sure he was still breathing. When his hands shook, I buttoned his shirts. When he forgot words, I pretended not to notice. When he could not get out of bed after surgery, I was there, not them. But in my family's eyes, I was not the daughter who cared for him. I was the failure who stayed in his house for the inheritance. My brother only came around when he needed money. He knew how to talk about business, future deals, and hard times, but never found time to sit with our father. My sister lived in Denver and posted about family love online, even though she could go months without calling. My stepmother, Carol, was the most dangerous of all because she smiled softly and moved quietly. Little by little, she started controlling his phone, his mail, his accounts, and even when I was allowed to enter his room. I saw my father change around her. He became more careful with his words. He went quiet whenever she walked in. Sometimes he looked at me as if he wanted to warn me, but could not. I blamed his illness, his exhaustion, and the medication. It was easier to believe that than to admit something was wrong inside our own home. 3 weeks before he died, I saw an envelope from the estate lawyer's office on his table. My father quickly covered it with his hand. His eyes turned tense, almost guilty. I did not ask anything because I did not want to pressure him. Back then, I thought respect meant silence. Now I understand that my silence gave other people more room to lie. On the day the will was read, they sat around the table without any real grief. My brother kept turning his car keys in his hand. My sister checked her phone. Carol held a tissue, but her eyes stayed dry. When the lawyer read that the house would go to Carol, the car would go to my brother, and part of the accounts would go to my sister, no one looked surprised. When my name came up, followed by the amount of $1, the room stayed silent for only a second. Then I saw their faces. They knew. Maybe not every detail, but enough to wait for that exact moment. Carol lowered her eyes, my brother leaned back in his chair, and my sister barely held back a smile. I had not only been cut out of the will. I had been humiliated in front of the same people who spent years convincing my father that I was only there for money. The dollar itself was not the worst part. The worst part was thinking my father might have believed them. That all my sleepless nights, hospital drives, fear, and postponed life had ended with one line in a document. I left the office without saying a word. My throat felt so tight that any sound could have turned into tears. An hour later, I stood at the door of the house I had carried for 3 years. My key no longer fit the lock. My suitcase stood beside the steps. The window of my father's bedroom was dark. My family left me on the porch so quickly, it felt like they had been waiting for this day longer than they had feared his death. I picked up my suitcase and walked to my car, forcing myself not to look back. That was when my phone rang. The number on the screen belonged to the lawyer. His voicemail was short and very careful. My father had left a separate instruction for me, one that could not be read in front of the family. The lawyer asked me to return to his office before I left town. He also mentioned a second sealed envelope. I stood beside my car with the suitcase in my hand, staring at the locked front door of my father's house. For the first time that day, a frightening thought entered my mind. Maybe the real had not even begun yet. I drove back to the lawyer's office with my suitcase still in the back seat. The whole way there, my hands stayed tight around the steering wheel. Every red light felt too long. Every turn felt wrong. Part of me wanted to keep driving until my father's town disappeared in the rearview mirror. Another part of me knew that leaving without hearing the rest would haunt me for the rest of my life. The lawyer's office was almost empty when I arrived. The receptionist had gone home, and the hallway lights were dimmer than before. Rain tapped against the windows, soft but steady, filling the silence between my steps. The same conference room where I had been humiliated an hour earlier now looked different without my family inside it. The polished table, the leather chairs, the framed certificates on the wall all seemed colder, like they had witnessed something ugly and stayed quiet. The lawyer looked tired when he let me in. He did not act surprised by what had happened at the house. That told me more than I wanted to know. He placed a thick folder on the table, then set a sealed envelope beside it. My name was written across the front in my father's handwriting. Not typed. Not copied. Written by the same shaky hand I had held so many times during his last months. Seeing it made my chest tighten. For 3 years, I had watched that hand lose strength. It used to fix engines, build shelves, carve pumpkins, and lift grocery bags like they weighed nothing. Near the end, it trembled around a spoon. It struggled with buttons. It reached for me at night when pain scared him more than he wanted to admit. Now that hand had left me a message after death. Before I touched the envelope, the lawyer explained that my father had made special arrangements. The first will had been real, legal, and carefully written. It was not a mistake. That sentence hit me harder than I expected because some small part of me had still been hoping for an error. A missing page. A confused clause. Some clean explanation that would make the pain less personal. There was no error. My father had meant for that first document to be read exactly as it was. He had meant for Carol, my brother, and my sister to hear their names before mine. He had meant for them to believe they had won. The thought made my stomach turn, not because I hated him, but because I did not understand him. Then I remembered the last months. Carol had started sitting beside him whenever paperwork came in. She answered calls before I could reach the phone. She carried his mail upstairs and brought it back later, already opened. My brother suddenly visited twice in 1 week after ignoring him for months. My sister flew in from Denver with a bright smile and left 3 days later with an envelope tucked into her purse. At the time, I told myself grief made people strange. Now those moments lined up in my mind like warning signs I had walked past with my eyes closed. There had been whispers in the kitchen. Bank statements that disappeared. A nurse who once stopped talking when Carol entered the room. My father's old checkbook had gone missing, then appeared again in a drawer where he never kept it. I had noticed everything and understood nothing. The lawyer opened the folder first. Inside were copies of documents I had never seen. Some were medical forms. Others were bank records, property statements, and notes written after private meetings with my father. Several pages had dates from the same weeks when Carol claimed he was too tired to see anyone alone. My pulse started beating in my throat. One document showed that my father had requested meetings without Carol present. Another showed that he had changed certain instructions only after asking for a cognitive evaluation. The evaluation had confirmed he was still legally capable of making decisions. That meant one thing clearly. Whatever he had done near the end, he had done with a sound mind. That should have comforted me. Instead, it scared me more. Because if my father had been thinking clearly, then the $1 inheritance was not confusion. It was a plan. And if it was a plan, then he had been hiding something from everyone, including me. The lawyer pushed the sealed envelope closer. My father had written one sentence beneath my name. The words were uneven, but still readable. They told me not to blame myself for what I was about to learn. For a moment, I could not move. All the anger I had been holding began to shift into something heavier. I thought about Carol changing the locks, my brother carrying my suitcase, my sister smiling on that porch. They had thrown me out because they believed the story was over. But my father had left this envelope for the moment after they showed me who they really were. I slid my finger under the flap and opened it carefully. Inside was a letter, a small brass key, and a photograph I had never seen before. The picture showed my father standing in front of a house near a lake, with his arm around a woman who was not my mother and not Carol. On the back, he had written a date from 28 years ago. And under that date was a name I recognized immediately, even though no one in my family had spoken it since I was a child. The name on the back of the photograph was Margaret Hale. I had not heard it in years, but my body remembered it before my mind did. Margaret had been my mother's closest friend when I was little. She used to come over on Sundays with peach cobbler, loud bracelets, and stories that made my mother laugh until she cried. Then, almost overnight, she disappeared from our lives. No explanation. No goodbye. Just an empty chair at birthdays and a name nobody mentioned. Seeing her beside my father made the room tilt. The house in the photograph looked peaceful, almost too peaceful for the truth it seemed to carry. It sat behind them with blue shutters, a wide porch, and a line of pine trees leading toward the water. My father looked younger there, maybe 50, with stronger shoulders and a smile I had not seen in years. Margaret stood close to him, not like a stranger, and not exactly like a friend. A cold thought moved through me. For a few painful seconds, I wondered if my father had lived with a secret affair buried under our family's entire history. That would have explained the silence, the hidden key, and the way everyone avoided her name. It also would have broken something in me that grief had not reached yet. But the letter stopped that thought before it grew teeth. My father's handwriting filled 3 pages. Some words leaned crookedly, and a few lines faded where the pen must have slipped. Still, his voice was there. Not the weak voice from his final weeks, but the steady one I knew from childhood. The one that used to calm me during storms and tell me to look twice before trusting a smooth answer. He wrote that Margaret had never been his lover. She had been my mother's protector. Years ago, after my mother was diagnosed with cancer, she discovered something my father had missed. Money had been disappearing from their joint account. Small amounts at first, then larger withdrawals hidden between bills and medical costs. My mother thought it was a bank mistake until Margaret helped her trace the payments. They led to Carol. That part made my stomach tighten so sharply I almost dropped the letter. Carol had not entered our family after my mother died, the way she always claimed. She had been near it before, quietly circling the edges through a charity office where my father volunteered. My mother had known her name before any of us did. She had known enough to be afraid of her. Margaret helped my mother gather copies of statements, messages, and notes. Before my mother could decide what to do, her health collapsed. The fight became too much. She made Margaret promise to protect me if anything ever happened, but Margaret left town after being threatened by someone she refused to name. My father found out pieces of the truth only later, when guilt and grief had already swallowed him. For years, he blamed himself. Then Carol came back into his life with perfect timing. She was kind when he was lonely, helpful when he was overwhelmed, and patient when he was too tired to question coincidences. By the time I noticed her control, she already knew where his documents were kept, which accounts mattered, and how to make every concern sound like jealousy. My father had not been blind. He had been ashamed. The first will was his trap. He knew Carol would push for the visible assets, the house, the car, and the accounts she thought she understood. He also knew my brother and sister would follow anything that smelled like quick money. So he gave them exactly what they had been chasing and protected the rest somewhere they never thought to look. The brass key belonged to a safe deposit box. The lake house in the photograph was not listed in the will because it had never been part of the estate. It belonged to a trust my mother had created before she died, using Margaret as the original witness and my father as the temporary trustee. The final transfer had been completed 2 months before his death. The beneficiary was me. My hands went numb around the letter. The woman they had mocked on the porch, the daughter left with $1, had been the only person my parents had tried to protect from the beginning. Then the lawyer opened the thick folder again. Inside was one last page with Carol's signature on it, dated only 6 days before my father died. The lawyer placed it in front of me carefully, and the moment I read the first line, I understood why my father had been afraid. The page with Carol's signature was not a medical form. It was a petition prepared by another attorney, one my father's lawyer had never heard of. Carol had tried to have my father declared mentally unfit 6 days before he died. She claimed he was confused, paranoid, and unable to understand his own finances. She also claimed I had isolated him, pressured him, and manipulated him against the family. For a moment, I could not breathe. Every accusation on that page had been turned inside out. Carol had done those things, then placed my name over them like a mask. She had controlled his calls. She had opened his mail. She had kept relatives away whenever it helped her. But in her version, I was the danger. The lawyer showed me the next pages. Carol had requested emergency authority over his accounts, property, medical choices, and legal documents. If the court had approved it, she could have blocked every change he made. She could have challenged the trust, frozen the transfers, and painted me as a desperate daughter abusing a dying man. That was the moment I whispered it to myself. This was insane. Not messy. Not cruel. Not just another ugly fight over inheritance. It was planned, organized, and colder than anything I had imagined. Carol had not simply wanted the house. She had tried to erase my father's last decisions before anyone could see them. Then the lawyer handed me another sheet. It was a note from my father, written after he learned what Carol had filed. He explained that the $1 inheritance was not punishment. It was bait. He wanted Carol, my brother, and my sister to believe they had everything because greed made them careless. If they thought I had nothing, they would stop hiding their contempt long enough for the truth to show. That truth had already started showing. The folder held bank transfers from my father's accounts to companies tied to my brother. Some were labeled as home repairs that had never happened. Others were listed as consulting fees, even though my father had not owned a business in years. My sister's name appeared beside withdrawals for medical supplies that were never purchased. Carol's name appeared everywhere, always close to the money and never close to the blame. My face burned as I read. I remembered apologizing to them for being tired. I remembered feeling guilty when they called me controlling. I remembered standing in the pharmacy line, using my own credit card for his medication, while money moved quietly out of his accounts behind my back. They had made me feel ashamed for noticing. That was the part that hurt in a different way. Not only the stealing or the lies or even the legal trap. It was how carefully they had trained me to doubt myself. Every question became an accusation. Every concern became drama. Every boundary became proof that I was unstable. The lawyer then told me about the recordings. My father had installed small cameras in the main hallway and study after money began disappearing again. At first, he wanted proof for himself. Later, he wanted proof for me. He knew I would struggle to believe people could be that cruel, especially people who shared my last name. There was a flash drive in the folder. I did not want to watch it, but I knew I had to. The lawyer turned the conference room screen toward me and opened the first file. The video showed my father in his study, sitting in the leather chair by the window. Carol stood over him with papers in her hand. There was no sound at first, only the harsh movement of her gestures and his tired face. Then the audio started. Carol's voice was calm enough to scare me. She told him I was using his illness to control the house. She told him my brother deserved the car because he had a family image to maintain. She said my sister needed money more because she had children. Then she leaned closer and placed a pen in his hand. My father did not sign. He pushed the paper away with a trembling hand. Carol stood still for a long time. Then she smiled, collected the papers, and walked out of the room as if nothing had happened. The next recording was worse. My brother sat across from him, talking about a debt he had hidden from his wife. My father wrote him a check while looking like a man giving away peace he could not afford to lose. My sister appeared in another clip, taking a card from his desk drawer after Carol pointed toward it. No one looked guilty. They looked comfortable. That comfort broke me. I had spent years trying to protect the dignity of people who had none for me. I had softened their absence, covered their selfishness, and excused their coldness because admitting the truth felt too ugly. But the screen did not soften anything. It showed exactly what had been happening in that house while I was downstairs folding laundry, cooking soup, and blaming myself for the tension. The final video was dated 2 days before his death. My father was alone in the study. His breathing sounded rough, and his hands shook against the arms of the chair. He looked straight toward the camera, as if he knew I would be watching one day. On the desk beside him was the same second envelope now lying open in front of me. He had recorded a message. I watched his mouth move, but the first few seconds made no sound. The file glitched, then settled. His voice came through weak, low, and painfully clear. He explained that if I was seeing the recording, then the family had already shown me what he feared they would become. Then he lowered his eyes. The next words changed everything again. He said Carol had not been the first person to betray our family. She had only finished what someone else started years earlier. And the name he said next was my sister's. My sister's name hit me harder than Carol's ever could. Carol had always felt like an outsider wearing a family mask. My brother had always been selfish in a loud, obvious way. But my sister, Lauren, had known how to seem harmless. She cried easily, hugged gently, and used soft words whenever she wanted people to lower their guard. I had spent years defending her, even when she forgot Dad, ignored Mom's memory, and treated family like something she could visit when convenient. Now my father's recording was telling me she had been part of it from the beginning. The lawyer paused the video before I could ask for it. He said the next folder would be difficult, then slid another packet across the table. My sister's name appeared on the first page beside a bank account I had never seen. The account had been opened years before my mother died. At first, the deposits were small. Then they became regular. Then, during my mother's treatments, the withdrawals grew larger. My chest turned cold as the dates lined up. Some withdrawals happened on the same days my mother skipped appointments because she felt guilty about the cost. Others happened near hospital bills my father had struggled to pay. One transfer was made 2 days after Mom sold a necklace her grandmother had left her. I remembered that necklace. I remembered her smiling while pretending she no longer liked wearing it. Lauren had been 17 then. That detail made everything worse, not easier. She had been young enough to hide behind innocence, but old enough to understand money disappearing from a sick woman. The notes in the folder showed that Carol had first approached her through a church fundraiser. She had given Lauren attention, gifts, rides, and sympathy during the worst months of Mom's illness. Then she had given her a secret. Carol convinced Lauren that Mom was wasting family money trying to stay alive. She made my sister believe Dad would end up broke and that someone had to protect what would be left. Lauren started sharing details about our home, our bills, and Mom's appointments. Later, she helped Carol access account information by taking photos of papers on Dad's desk. I wanted to reject every word. Instead, pieces from childhood began returning with sickening clarity. Lauren suddenly having cash for clothes. Carol appearing at events where no one had invited her. Mom crying in the laundry room while holding a bank statement. Dad and Margaret whispering in the kitchen, then stopping when I walked in. The betrayal had not started after Mom died. It had been living inside our house while she was still fighting to breathe. My father's note explained why he never confronted Lauren publicly. By the time he understood her role, Mom was gone, Margaret had left town, and Lauren had buried herself under years of denial. He tried to believe she had been manipulated. He wanted to think guilt would change her. But when he got sick, Lauren repeated the same pattern with Carol, only this time she was no longer a confused teenager. This time, she wanted her share. The lawyer showed me recent messages printed from my father's phone. Lauren had written that I was unstable, bitter, and too attached to the house. She suggested Dad should protect the family from me before I trapped him into changing documents. Carol responded with calm instructions, telling her what to say, when to visit, and how to sound worried instead of greedy. I stared at the pages until the words blurred. All those months, I had wondered why Dad sometimes looked wounded after Lauren called. I had assumed he missed her. I had assumed her distance hurt him. Now I understood that her calls had not been distance at all. They had been pressure wrapped in a daughter's voice. Something inside me hardened. Not into hatred. Hatred would have given them too much space inside my life. It hardened into clarity, the kind that arrives after years of confusion suddenly stop protecting you. I finally saw the pattern. Carol planted fear. Lauren gave it family weight. My brother followed the money. Then all three pointed at me, because I was the only one still close enough to notice. The lawyer closed the folder gently. There was one more step before the trust could fully transfer to me. The safe deposit box had to be opened in person, using the brass key from the envelope. My father had left the final documents there, along with whatever proof Margaret had saved before leaving town. The appointment had already been scheduled for the next morning. I left the office after dark, carrying the folder against my chest like it might burn through me. My phone had 12 missed calls from Carol, 5 from my brother, and 1 voicemail from Lauren. I did not listen to any of them. Then, in the hotel parking lot, I saw my sister waiting beside my car. She was still wearing her funeral dress, and in her hand, she held a copy of the photograph from the lake house. Lauren stood beside my car like she had been waiting for hours. Her funeral dress was wrinkled at the waist, and rain had flattened her hair against her cheeks. In one hand, she held the copy of the lake house photograph. In the other, she held her phone so tightly her knuckles looked white. She did not look sorry. She looked frightened that I had learned too much. That scared me more than anger would have. For years, Lauren had survived by seeming fragile. She could make her silence look like pain, her distance look like stress, and her selfishness look like survival. Even then, standing under the hotel lights, she tried to wear the face of a wounded sister. But I had seen the bank records. I had read the messages. That face no longer worked on me. I did not stop walking. My room was on the second floor, facing the parking lot. Every step toward the entrance felt like a test. I knew she wanted me to react. She wanted tears, panic, maybe a scene someone could record and use later. That had always been their strongest weapon against me. They pushed until I broke, then pointed at the pieces as proof. This time, I gave her nothing. Inside my room, I locked the door and placed the folder on the desk. My hands shook only after I was alone. The old part of me wanted to explain, defend myself, answer every missed call, and prove I was not the villain they had built. But the new part, the part my father had been trying to wake up, understood something simple. Truth did not need to beg. I called the lawyer's emergency number and reported that Lauren had been waiting by my car with a copy of a private trust-related photograph. He told me to save every voicemail, every text, and every screenshot. By then, my phone had started lighting up again. Carol. My brother. Lauren. Then Carol again. Their panic had a rhythm. Carol's messages were polished and cold. My brother's were angry and messy. Lauren's were soft, trembling, and full of guilt she wanted me to carry for her. None of them asked how I was after being thrown out. None of them apologized for the porch, the locks, or the $1 humiliation. They only wanted to know what the lawyer had given me. That told me everything. The next morning, I arrived at the bank with the brass key in my coat pocket. The lawyer met me in the lobby, carrying a black briefcase and looking more serious than he had the day before. The safe deposit room was quiet, windowless, and colder than the rest of the building. A bank manager checked our IDs, opened the first lock, and stepped aside. My hand opened the second. Inside the box were 3 things: a sealed packet of trust documents, a flash drive labeled with my mother's name, and a stack of letters tied with blue ribbon. On top of the letters was another note from my father. He had written that some truths arrived too late to save the past, but not too late to save a life. I knew he meant mine. The documents confirmed that the lake house, a protected investment account, and a life insurance payout had all been placed outside the visible estate. My father had not made me rich in some flashy way. He had made me safe. For the first time in years, I could pay my debts, leave that town, and stop depending on people who enjoyed seeing me cornered. Then the lawyer opened the flash drive. The first file was not from my father. It was from Margaret Hale. Her voice was older than I remembered, but steady enough to cut through the room. She explained what my mother had discovered before she died, what Carol had taken, and why the lake house had been kept secret. Then Margaret said something I was not ready for. My mother had known Lauren was involved. And that truth nearly broke me. For most of my life, I had believed Mom died carrying only fear, pain, and unfinished love. I imagined her too sick to notice the small betrayals around her. I told myself she never saw the way money vanished, the way Lauren changed, or the way Carol kept appearing where she did not belong. That lie had protected me for years. Margaret's recording took it away in minutes. She explained that Mom found the missing statements hidden inside Lauren's school binder. At first, she refused to believe what she was seeing. Lauren was still her daughter. Still the girl who borrowed her sweaters and left cereal bowls in the sink. But then Mom found notes in Lauren's handwriting, copied account numbers, and a phone number that led back to Carol. The room seemed to shrink around me. My mother had not confronted Lauren because she was already too weak for another war. She had tried to leave quietly documented proof instead. Margaret helped her copy papers, write dates, and place everything somewhere Carol could not reach. The lake house had been purchased years earlier with money from my mother's side of the family, and she moved it into the trust to keep it away from the people circling my father. That was when I understood the real inheritance. It was not only property. It was protection passed from a dying mother to a guilty father, then from him to me. They had both known I would keep loving people who kept hurting me. They had both known I would explain away cruelty if it wore a familiar face. The lawyer gave me time to breathe, but breathing felt strange. For years, I had carried guilt that did not belong to me. I felt guilty for living in Dad's house. Guilty for asking questions. Guilty for being tired. Guilty for not trusting Carol more. Meanwhile, the people accusing me had been moving money, hiding documents, and preparing to take everything once my father was gone. By noon, the lawyer filed the first legal notices. Carol was informed that the trust assets were separate from the estate. My brother learned that the car he celebrated came with debt and unpaid fees. Lauren was warned not to contact me directly about the documents, the lake house, or anything related to the trust. Every message had to go through attorneys now. Their reaction came fast. Carol hired a lawyer and claimed Dad had been manipulated. My brother sent angry voice messages about loyalty, family shame, and how I had always thought I was better than everyone. Lauren sent one long text pretending to confess, just enough to sound human, but not enough to admit what she had done. She blamed Carol, grief, being young, and fear. She blamed everything except her own choices. I read it once, then saved it for the lawyer. Something had changed in me. The old version would have answered. She would have cried, explained, apologized for being hurt, and tried to rescue a bond that had been used as a leash. This version of me sat in a quiet hotel room, printed every message, and let the truth do what my emotions never could. 2 days later, Carol's attorney withdrew part of her challenge. The recordings were too clear. The bank transfers were too organized. The medical evaluation proved Dad had been competent when he finalized the trust. My brother stopped calling when he learned some of his payments might be treated as financial exploitation. Lauren went silent after the lawyer mentioned Margaret's files. Their silence felt louder than their threats. I returned to my father's house only once. Not to fight. Not to plead. Just to collect the few things that were legally mine from the guest room. Carol stood in the hallway, pale and smaller than I remembered. The woman who had changed the locks now avoided looking at the folder in my hands. The house felt different without fear guiding me. I packed my clothes, my mother's recipe box, and the framed photo of Dad holding me at a county fair. Before leaving, I stood outside his bedroom and waited for grief to crush me. Instead, something quieter arrived. Not peace exactly, but distance. The kind that lets you see a prison after the door opens. That evening, the lawyer called with one final update. The lake house was ready for transfer, the investment account had cleared, and my father's last personal letter had been found inside the trust packet. Unlike the others, this one had no legal purpose. It was marked for me to read only after I chose whether to keep fighting or walk away. I sat on the hotel bed with the envelope in my lap. By then, I had enough evidence to destroy them publicly. But my father had left me one final choice, and somehow I knew that choice would decide what kind of life I stepped into next. I stared at my father's last letter for almost an hour before opening it. The envelope felt heavier than paper should. By then, I had proof, protection, and enough truth to burn what was left of my family's reputation. Carol had lied. My brother had taken money. Lauren had betrayed our mother before she was even gone. Every cruel thing they said about me had been a cover for what they had done themselves. Part of me wanted everyone to know. I wanted my brother's wife to see the transfers. I wanted Lauren's perfect online life to crack under the truth. I wanted Carol to lose the calm little smile she wore while changing the locks on me. After years of being called unstable, greedy, and dramatic, I wanted the world to finally point in the right direction. Then I opened the letter. My father did not ask me to forgive them. That surprised me first. He knew better than to dress poison in holy words. He wrote that forgiveness was mine to give or keep, and no one had the right to demand it from me. What he asked was smaller, harder, and somehow more painful. He asked me not to become their prisoner after I had finally escaped. He wrote that some people steal money, but others steal years. They steal sleep, trust, confidence, and the quiet feeling that your own life belongs to you. He feared I would win the legal fight, then spend the rest of my life replaying their cruelty until they still owned every room inside my head. I had to stop reading for a moment. Those words found the deepest part of me. Because even with the trust secured, even with the lake house waiting, I was still imagining arguments I would never have. Still writing speeches in my mind. Still trying to make them understand the pain they had caused, as if understanding had ever been what they wanted. My father had seen that pattern in me. He wrote about my mother next. He said she had died hurt, but not blind. She knew more than I ever imagined, and still spent her final strength making sure I would one day have somewhere safe to land. The lake house was not meant to be a trophy. It was meant to be a door. A door out of guilt. A door out of begging for love. A door out of a family that confused access with loyalty. By the time I finished the letter, the anger had not disappeared. It had simply changed shape. It no longer felt like fire begging to spread. It felt like a boundary. Clean, firm, and long overdue. I followed the lawyer's advice. I did not post the recordings. I did not call relatives to explain. I did not send Lauren a paragraph about mom, betrayal, or the years she helped poison. The evidence stayed where it belonged, in legal files, ready if they ever tried to come for me again. That was enough. Carol kept the house, but not the victory she imagined. The mortgage, unpaid repairs, and legal fees turned it into a burden within months. My brother sold the car after learning how much was still owed on it. Lauren disappeared from social media for a while, then returned with posts about healing, growth, and complicated families. I let her have her captions. They were not my courtroom. I moved to the lake house in early spring. It was smaller than it looked in the photograph, with blue shutters, an old porch swing, and pine trees that made the air smell clean after rain. The first night, I slept on an air mattress, because I had not bought furniture yet. I woke before sunrise to the sound of water against the shore, and for the first time in years, no one needed me, accused me, or watched me like I was taking up space. I cried harder that morning than I had at the funeral. Not because I was sadder. Because I was finally safe enough to feel everything. I cried for my father's fear, my mother's silence, and the years I wasted trying to earn kindness from people who used my love as evidence against me. Then I made coffee in a chipped mug I found in the cabinet, sat on the porch steps, and let the cold air calm me down. Peace did not arrive all at once. Some days, I still wanted answers. Some nights, I dreamed about the porch, the suitcase, and the lock that no longer turned. But little by little, my life stopped orbiting their choices. I found work with a hospice support group. I paid off the credit cards I had used during Dad's illness. I planted lavender near the steps because my mother used to love the smell. The second envelope did change everything. But not because it made me rich. It changed everything because it proved I had not imagined the cruelty. It proved my father had not stopped loving me. Most of all, it proved that being left out of one document did not mean being left out of the truth. A year later, I received one last letter. It came with no return address, only my name written in handwriting I recognized immediately. Lauren had sent it. I did not open it right away. I placed it on the kitchen table beside my father's old photograph and watched the sun move across the floor. Maybe one day I would read it. Maybe I would not. For the first time in my life, I understood that not every door needed to be reopened just because someone knocked. My family had laughed when they thought I had been left with nothing. What they never understood was that my parents had left me the one thing they could not steal. A life that finally belonged to me.